If you're ready to unlock more better days, to take control of your health, to push past your limits and unleash your full potential, then you're in the right place. I'm your host, Dr. Jeremy Bettle. For over 2 decades, I've worked with elite athletes and high performers, helping them optimize their bodies, strengthen their minds, and recover from setbacks. Now I'm bringing that expertise to you through the Vitality Collective podcast. In each episode, we'll dive deep into the science, strategies, and real-world solutions you can apply right away. Whether it's enhancing your physical performance, avoiding or recovering from injury, sharpening your mental edge, or simply feeling your best every single day. With insights from top experts and thought leaders, this podcast is designed to help you take action, feel better, and live the life that you deserve. Welcome to the Vitality Collective podcast, where every day is vital. Today, I'm joined by Holly Baxter, an accredited practicing dietitian, physique coach, and science educator who coaches athletes and everyday clients on body composition. In this episode, we get into what fat loss actually involves physiologically, why muscle building takes far longer than most people expect, and how to structure a realistic approach to your training and nutrition without sacrificing your lifestyle. If you've ever felt confused by the number on the scale, overwhelmed by the gap between what you see online and what's actually possible, or just not sure where to start, this conversation's for you. Let's get into it. Welcome back, everybody. Today, what an honor it is to welcome Holly Baxter to the show. We're going to be diving into body composition with the lessons we can learn from the bodybuilding world and how we can apply that into everyday life. Holly, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to chat with you today.
Yeah, this is going to be fantastic. It's really interesting as I've had the journey out of pro sport and seeing how much of the athlete's day-to-day life can be brought into the general population. Now, I work in the general population. It's really interesting because everybody sees that last bit that happens like on the ice, on the court, right? That elite level of performance, but they don't see the years of work that it takes to get there. Mm-hmm. And what happened on that day is very different what happens throughout the off season. And I know it's very much the same in the bodybuilding world. So I'm really excited to have a look at what that means in terms of manipulating body composition and getting ready for those shows.
My goodness. Look, it's funny. I don't think that the overarching principles that I implement with my everyday clients are overly different to the strategies that I implement with my athletes. I think the primary difference for physique competitors versus my everyday, person who's trying to improve their body comp, get healthy, get a little fitter, might just be their end body composition. So their body fat percentage is arguably a lot lower as a professional physique athlete than somebody, just striving for normal weight loss. And I think the unfortunate thing about this is that, bodybuilding kind of represents this elite group of individuals that tends to be like where the inspiration for a lot of everyday people, comes from. But I think the reality of, that outcome is that there are significant sacrifices that are required to get there that I think most people aren't willing or perhaps able to do. And that's okay. And I think one of the things that I found helpful for my Gen Pop clients over the years is just kind of pointing out, those subtle differences and helping them have realistic expectations around what can be done with a normal human schedule, because it does require a lot of adjustment and finagling to kind of end up looking like the professional athlete on stage that we see.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly the conversation we wanted to have, because I don't think a lot of people are aware of the level of sacrifice it takes to look like that. You can't just go to the gym like 1 hour a day and think that, on top of all your other stuff, that's going to be enough to make you look like a competition ready bodybuilder or physique competitor. And as we dig into this, I want to put some definitions around some of the terms, because I won't say everybody, a lot of people in the general population world are looking for weight loss, right? A lot of the searches online, a lot of people come to us, I want to lose weight. I want to dig into the difference between weight and body composition. fat mass, lean mass, muscle mass, that you hear all these terms being thrown around lately. Can you help us out with some of those definitions for the listeners on what is weight loss? What is body comp change?
Mhm. Absolutely. Well, I think unfortunately, weight loss is probably the term that's thrown around more loosely on social media
Yeah.
and everywhere, really. But that could be any kind of weight loss. And I think when I'm thinking about, changes in body composition for a client that I'm working with, I very specifically want fat loss, and I'm
Yes.
trying to retain lean mass to the best of my ability. So,
Right.
what is lean mass? Again, there are probably several different terms or definitions, and they might have subtle differences about them. But from my perspective and what the scientific literature would, refer to it as, fat-free mass, which is
Mm-hmm.
that is a combination of glycogen, water, hair, skin, nail,
Right.
bone, and skeletal muscle mass. And unfortunately, fat free mass is usually the marker or indicator that's provided to us if you went and had, say, a DEXA scan or an in body scan. So it's not specifically isolating skeletal muscle mass.
Right.
So when we get, a result of plus point or plus 7 pounds of fat free mass, a lot of
Right.
folks will interpret that result as I gained 7 pounds of muscle.
Right.
But the
Right.
reality of that is a small portion of that might be indeed skeletal muscle, but we're also considering the fact that now that person has more muscle, there's more potential for glycogen storage inside that
Mm-hmm.
muscle.
Mm-hmm.
For every gram of glycogen we store, there's 2 or 3 mil of water that's also pulled into the muscle.
Yep.
And there's a host of other things. So, fat free mass is a term that's often used, but it
Mm-hmm.
encompasses much more than just skeletal muscle. Fat mass, as it's described, is just lipid or adipose tissue, which is what we're trying to reduce during fat
Right.
loss. So those are the two kind of key distinctions, I think. But I'm not a big fan. I want to kind of deviate just for a quick second. I'm not a big
Yeah.
fan of any kind of in-body scan or
Mm-hmm.
even DEXA scan, depending on the model that's being used,
Yeah.
because they're not able to distinguish the differences between fat-free mass and muscle mass specifically.
Mm-hmm.
So they kind of conflate one another. And so many times I've had clients go and have an in-body scan and they've just finished a diet. And you can
Yeah.
imagine, after 12 weeks of fat loss or dieting, they've had some meaningful changes in their nutrition. So, maybe their carbohydrates started out at 250 grams at the beginning and now they're down to 130, for instance, in like maybe
Right.
a female client.
Yeah.
That's going to significantly change your muscle glycogen storage. And that's going to register on an in-body or on a DEXA
Yes.
scan as you've just lost fat-free mass. And I
Yes.
have, people coming to me like so upset, like I've lost all the muscle that I just gained during this build.
Right.
It's the end of the world. So I think it's really important to recognize that there are fundamental issues with those types of measurements that people are often accessing and, using to help guide their progress. So
Yeah.
the recommended protocol or tool, I should say, that I would use in my clients, and we're very fortunate. I have an affiliation with the University of South Florida here,
Right.
but we use B mode ultrasound. So when you
Right.
look at a lot of research studies will predominantly use B mode ultrasound. Sorry, my cat is deciding to join us today.
Always welcome.
We'll
Always
just pop
welcome
him
the cat.
down for a second. I apologize. Sorry.
Mine
Yeah,
will make an appearance any moment now. I guarantee it.
so B mode ultrasound is arguably the more scientifically accurate way to
Yeah.
assess like true changes in your muscle. So it measures
Yeah.
muscle thickness. So you can imagine if you put like an ultrasound probe like on your bicep and you're looking down in towards the bone, it measures muscle thickness. And
Mm-hmm.
that's how most scientific studies report changes in muscle mass. So if anybody that's listening has an opportunity to get into a lab, whether it's a university near you or come
Yeah.
see us at USF,
Yeah.
we do these assessments, but it gives you such a better gauge of how you are progressing with your programming.
Yeah.
Because it's actually measuring a direct like muscle site as opposed
Yeah.
to something that's indirect that includes all of these other variables that aren't truly just muscle.
Yeah.
Sorry, I went on a tangent there. It was important.
It's so important to bring up because we hear these words gold standard and body comp measurements, and most doctors' offices have an in-body now. And these different devices all have so big an error rate, but not just for the machine itself, the time of day, the what have you eaten, are you hydrated, the lack of consistency in how a single device is implemented is wildly different. So you could go at the start of your diet, you could go and get measured in the morning, fasted, all the rest of it, and you're nicely hydrated. And then you go at the end of your diet and you're in the evening and it's the weekend and you're fed and all this, and you just get these wildly different results that can blunt a lot of your actual progress. So I think even if you are selecting a suboptimal measurement device, at least keeping it consistent is such an important thing, because everyone doesn't have access to a lab, right? So I think that's an important thing is how are we triangulating data points?
Mm-hmm.
What is meaningful to us, in terms of how we're measuring this progress?
Yeah, absolutely. And that is my backup option. I think a DEXA scan would be a good alternative, but exactly
Yeah.
as you described, I think the conditions under which you take those assessments is so critical. So I would even go to the extent of saying to a client, if you're going to use those measurements, recognize that they aren't quite as precise as something like an MRI, which is truly the gold standard, or a B-mode ultrasound. So, that we have to give some kind of thought and consideration to that. But don't compare your end of fat loss to the beginning of your fat loss. Don't compare the end of a muscle build to the end of a fat loss. Like, the
Yeah.
differences in your body composition, just because of the changes in water and glycogen, are going to be
Mm-hmm.
profound. So,
Yeah.
at least if you are using those, use the same device, same time of day, and under the same conditions, which I mean, compare end of fat loss with end of fat loss, end of
Yeah.
muscle build with end of muscle build, at least as a starting point.
That's a really interesting point. I haven't heard it described like that, the different phases. And I'd really like to just dig into that really leaning into why the weight as a number, just getting on the scale, is such a challenge. Michelle and I talk about this all the time, but you can get on the scale one day, you get on the scale next day, you've gained 4 pounds. And I've had clients where it's like meltdown. I gained 4 pounds yesterday. Like, well, yes, but weight being everything that's contained within your body, time of day, how much you've eaten, what's still in your intestines being digested. You didn't gain 4 pounds of fat. And I think, as you've just articulated, all of the different things that go into what is lean mass,
Mm-hmm.
it's not that you gained 4 pounds of fat when you stepped on the scale. And similarly, when you lose weight, it can be very misleading. You didn't necessarily just lose body fat. Rapid weight loss is
Mm-hmm.
very challenging to actually lose body fat. We know when you're starving, you're living off your muscle tissue, right? And so we've got to really mitigate our muscle loss as we're dieting. So it's such important points on all of that measurement piece.
Yeah, I think one final thought on just the scale weight in general. And I know so many people struggle with hopping on because they're fearful of that number. And that's something that
Mm-hmm.
I try to work a lot with on my clientele. I think
Yeah.
my background has come from disordered eating, and I now
Mm-hmm.
predominantly work with a lot of people that are struggling with either eating disorders or disordered eating.
Yeah.
And I think, just first off, the education piece in the scale itself is so important, because
Yeah.
once you have a fundamental understanding of what inputs affect the scale, it kind of takes away its power. And I love data. I'm a big data nerd. So for my clients, we track a lot of stuff, and I really find it valuable. And I believe they probably do too, by kind of having, multiple weights taken throughout the week. And then when
Mm-hmm.
I do their check-ins, just kind of pointing out the correlation. So they might have a couple of days where, they're up to 3 pounds, like you alluded to
Mm-hmm.
before. And I can say to them, isn't it interesting? Look at your sodium intake from the last 2 days. It's
Yeah.
50% more than last week's
Yeah.
average. That's going to have a meaningful influence on your total body water. So that wasn't a fat
Mm-hmm.
change. And now look at the changes in your fiber. You mentioned, food volume sitting in your GI.
Yeah.
your fiber intake on average this week is up by 10 grams. That's a
Right.
significant increase. So,
Right.
that's also skewing your weight, positively, but it's not a true indicator that you've suddenly gained body fat. So I love,
Mm-hmm.
just as a general rule of thumb, when I'm talking to clients, to think about their weight, and what's a normal fluctuation. Somewhere
Yeah.
between 1% and 3% is very normal, and it can have nothing to do with changes in fat mass. So if
Right.
somebody's weight went up, let's say they were 125 pounds, and their weight went up in a particular week by 1.25, 1%, I will point out to them, based on all these metrics, based on your intense training volumes this week, and look how much
Mm-hmm.
more work you did. There's inflammation, there's fluid retention. Look at all the salt that you ate. Like, those
Yeah.
in and of itself are the likely cause for this change, completely unrelated to any changes in fat mass. So I think just having that history of data, which builds trust and confidence,
Yeah.
allows
Yeah.
people to kind of fear the scale a little bit less.
Yeah. And it's interesting. I appreciate explaining that. And you'd mentioned the disordered eating part, and on a previous podcast I heard with you, you had really dug into the fact that there's a lot of psychology around the weight loss piece, and there's sort of there's camps of people setting up, as we tend to have on the internet. There's the don't ever diet, watch what you eat, look at anything. Then there's the extreme diet, optimization end of the spectrum. But I like your sort of middle of the road approach, and it's very similar to how we view this, where it's not for me to judge what your goals are.
Mhm,
If you want to lose weight, if you want to lose body fat, that's your goal. My job is to educate you and make sure that you do that safely.
mhm,
And I think that's an important part of digging into the drivers behind the desire around weight loss,
mhm.
and the focus on the scale. And I similarly struggle a lot with body dysmorphia. And I think a lot of people who have been athletes
Mhm.
and then don't look like they did as a 20-year-old athlete anymore, it's
Mm.
really quite difficult. And we've done bodybuilding preps, we've done like the whole cut down and all the rest of it. And it affects your psychology,
Mm.
like when you see yourself like that. So I'd love to dig into that a little bit and just talk about how you work with your clients, how you've dealt with it yourself in being in that world, the psychology around weight loss.
Yeah, goodness. I mean, that's a whole, like, conversation in itself. I don't know whether we will possibly have time to get
Yeah,
into all of that. But
yeah,
maybe
yeah,
I can touch on that one piece that you referenced there, which was you're working with people that have been former athletes. So I would say I
mm,
work with a lot of athletes, but I'm also working with a lot of
yeah,
people that are transitioning into what I would consider like a normal lifestyle. They're no
yeah,
longer single, they've got a family now, and they've had to
yeah,
make some compromises in, life's decisions, which is also very, a very normal thing that happens. So I think a lot of the psychology behind what I would teach is helping people like adjust their expectations, change their perception, reframe the way that they're looking at sport.
mm,
Because, in this set of circumstances where you've now got children and other work responsibilities and just different life stresses,
mm,
it's such a different scenario than when you were, the elite athlete. And we
right,
shouldn't have the same expectations about, our training effort, intensity, outcomes. So I think just trying to help people soften their perspective a little bit around their goals is
mm,
honestly it sounds simple, like change your perspective, but that change
yeah,
is really hard. So I think having somebody to kind of help support that narrative and make it normal, help them to feel more comfortable in this new lifestyle is really
mm,
important. And often they held themselves to such high standards,
yeah,
and they're still holding themselves to the same standard with like 50 more responsibilities. So
exactly,
yeah, I think a lot of it is like changing your narrative, that internal belief system that once served you well to,
yeah,
something that's a little bit more realistic and sustainable for the current environment. So
yeah,
I know we could dive into this whole topic of
yeah.
psychology. I feel like that's just such a big one to tackle.
It is, and I think it's in a conversation around weight loss, it's an important caveat to it, is that it
Mm,
often
the driver behind that is, I'm going to be happy when I am leaner. My relationship will be better. Whatever the list of reasons, you're going to lose that weight and likely find that many of those are not fulfilled.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's just, as we work with people, it's having them understand those drivers. And let's also work on some of those things while we actually go through this phase of your training.
Yeah, I think for me, as I was going through a bit of a transition from like the elite mindset to being a bit more normal and just juggling more like in the business sense, I think my values and my whole values system really changed. And I think I used to go from having, my number one priority, rain, hail, or shine, was, the physique sport that I was doing. And through a couple of adjustments in personal circumstances, changes in career,
Yeah.
it kind of moved down into like a second or third position. And I had also completely eliminated the whole value system of how exercising and moving your body is beneficial just from a health perspective. And
Yes.
that was never even on my radar. Like I only moved my body. I think as a female, again, I had a eating disorder for 15 years and was able to kind of
Wow.
overcome.
Yeah.
And yeah, the driver was aesthetics, and it was very much tied to my self-worth and my identity. And once I started to do the psychology work on reframing, how I viewed myself, and
Yeah.
started shifting my priorities and values more towards just moving your body for health.
Yeah.
Training for aesthetics and training for health are significantly different. That's going from 6 days a week of, 90-minute resistance training sessions back
Yeah.
to 2 to 3. That's excellent.
Yeah.
Now, that's the
Yeah.
perspective that I hold. I'm not as hard on myself if I don't get to 5 workouts a week. I look at
Yeah.
that and go, I did a great job for my health. And that's just as
Mhm.
important as this aesthetic goal, if not more important. So,
Yeah.
yeah, big shifts in
Well,
values.
it's interesting, isn't it? Like when you look at the outcomes in sport that we're going for, in working in the NBA or in ice hockey, playing in the NHL is the goal, performing at that level is the goal. In bodybuilding, the aesthetic is the goal.
Mm.
And the external validation or critique, it's all this external judgment on the appearance of it. I think it's a really unique pressure that is put on people in bodybuilding, physique competition in general. But even as we start looking at the young mothers on social media,
Mm-hmm.
and everybody trying to chase this ideal, it's a shift that we've really tried to focus on as well, is how do our bodies feel, and are we limited in any way in anything that we actually want to do, despite maybe not having the aesthetics that we would have liked to have earlier in life, in a different season of life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, look, I think just to provide some comment there, the general timeline, I think, for most people to be able to see meaningful change is probably around the 5-year mark. And I know that no one's excited for me to say that, but I believe it's true.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
have heard similar, maybe professional bodybuilders say, upwards of 10, it's the 10-year mark, when they start
Yeah.
to see people change. But the reality is, and maybe we can touch on some of the studies and the research about how muscle
Yeah.
grows, but when we're looking at 2 and 3 millimeter changes over a typical 8 to 12 week study, again, using that muscle thickness measurement,
Yeah.
and that's kind of a normative change, it's unlikely that we're going to see, meaningful results in the mirror, even within the first 6 months. And I'll have
Yes.
clients all the time say, this is the person that I love their aesthetic. They seem strong, they're very fit, and they're lean and muscular. And they're 12 months into their own journey, never lifted a weight prior to, coming
Yes.
into work with us. And, I kind of have to point out, a lot of the people that you are aspiring to look like have a decade of training and consistency under their
Right.
belt. And it does take quite a few years to accrue the amount of muscle that you're going to see in the mirror. So, I'd ask the audience listening, do you think you could really see over 12 weeks, 3 millimeters, if you've also got some, external body fat, some adipose tissue covering that,
Yeah.
which would be normal and healthy? I would
Right.
put my hand and say no. Like if a client will
Right.
ask me in like 12 weeks into a building phase, can you see my muscle growing? And I will be very honest and say no, but my ultrasound can. That's what
Yeah,
that's I
exactly.
can't see that in a mirror. I might see more muscle fullness if they're eating
Yeah.
more carbohydrate and,
Yeah.
they have a slightly rounder appearance. Maybe they've gained a little body fat, but it's very difficult to see those changes. So I think around the 5-year mark, having consistently trained, 2 or 3 times a week, that's when
hmm
we would start to see, some pretty nice changes in the mirror.
That is such an important point. We've tried to make this point over and over. So that was beautifully articulated. The timelines people expect results on have been very much skewed by, I think, the internet. Here's a 4-week
Mm,
program, 6-week abs, all
mm,
this stuff that's given to us. When I tell people, we're 12 months out from you starting to see change,
mhm,
it's mind blowing for people, isn't it? And it's really well articulated that physiological adaptation sort of starts in that 6 to 8 weeks, but it's 3 millimeters over your whole body.
mhm.
Right?
And they're not even
That's
dispersed
not
evenly.
no, exactly. So let's dig into this then. I'd love to switch into this bodybuilding world.
Mhm.
You mentioned like a 10-year cycle that somebody might be on to really sort of get to that point where they're seeing, a meaningful, they're an elite pro. What are the phases that they will go through? In sport, we have our off season when we really dig into physical prep. We have our pre-season training camp, in season, and then we have our playoffs.
Mhm.
What would that yearly breakdown be for a bodybuilder?
It probably depends on their like competition aspirations. I have some people come to me very last minute, spontaneously, and they'll say, "I'm competing in 8 weeks. Can you bring me in?" And I'm like, "Oh goodness, okay."
Oh,
But there are other people that have perhaps more realistic expectations, and they're willing to do the work to get there. So I think
yeah.
in an ideal scenario, I'd say 6 months as a minimum time frame in a intentional building season. And I don't think that that means that you need to pile on excessive amounts of body fat. I think a lot of people
Mhm.
are afraid of what could potentially happen again on the scale.
Yeah.
But it's interesting, we don't have a lot of great data in what kind of a surplus we truly need, at least
Mhm.
under like a broad array of different population groups. So a lot of the surplus dieting studies that we have look at individuals that have like a normal, body fat percentage of say 25 to 35%. What we don't have a lot of information on are leaner individuals. For me, unfortunately, that tends to be my population. I'm working with people that
Yeah.
are probably sub 25% body fat who are kind of
Mhm.
pushing to the next level. They've done a lot of the work on their own and now they're trying to refine that process.
Mhm.
Um, and we don't really have great data about how much more energy we need or how much more body fat we need to optimize muscle growth.
Yeah.
In fact, our lab here at USF are about to run that exact study in females with less than 15% body fat, and we'll be
Wow.
comparing eating at maintenance, eating in a surplus, and eating in a deficit. And they're going to
Oh, wow.
all follow the same resistance training program. It'll be a 12-week study. And
Mhm.
then we will look at the muscle adaptations using B-mode ultrasound and muscle thickness. So it'll be curious to see what those findings tell us. I suspect that if you have a higher body fat percentage, and if you had to draw a line in the sand, let's just say 25% and above, I would say that for that population, we don't need to put you into a surplus. You have a
Mhm.
sufficient amount of adipose tissue on your person that is going to afford you the ability to build and lay down new tissue through an
Yeah.
effective resistance training program. But I think for leaner individuals where there's less adipose tissue, we haven't got the same kind of energy reservoir to pull from. I think for those folks, that might be one area where I think that we probably do need to move them into a slight surplus just to ensure that we're getting, good results.
Yeah.
So, I guess beyond that, 6 months of resistance training in a building phase, following a very
Yeah.
structured program that's sufficiently volumed, that's,
Yeah.
performed at a high intensity. And then we would move into usually a cutting phase, as 6 months is generally the timeline I think most people are tolerant of a build and they are
Yeah.
ready to cut.
Yeah. So can I
I-
just pause before we move on? I want to point out some things to people there, like this building phase where the goal is to increase muscle mass, right?
Mhm.
What you talked about there was the surplus, and this is a calorie intake. So your nutrition has to be in line in order to build mass. As we relate this over to general population,
Mhm.
I just want people to understand that if we're not eating enough, it's going to be really hard to add lean mass, add muscle, even bone mass that comes along with that. It's going to be very challenging. So as we get these professionals who are adding muscle mass, which is what you're trying to do, you're going to have to be eating, right?
Yes, you need to have energy. I think the analogy I always use is if you wanted to build a house, you can't build a house without any money. So you need to
Yes.
have some energy available, whether it's through stored body fat or from the calories you are directly taking in from food. It
Right,
can be a
right.
combination of both, in efforts to create new proteins and to build muscle. So yes, you definitely want to
Yeah,
have some money floating around to help with
exactly.
that building
Yeah.
process.
Okay. All right. So we've spent 6 months in this building phase. We're a significant amount of time building muscle. And then you said we go into a cutting phase. So what's the goal here, and what does that look like?
Yeah, so I think everybody's goal is going to be a little bit different. Obviously, we all have different body fat percentages. Some have greater aspirations of more body fat loss than others. So there's always going to be a unique and individual approach there. But ultimately, you need to set a reasonable, safe, and efficacious weekly rate of weight loss. And through various studies, in fact, countless studies, they have shown us that targeting a weekly rate of weight loss under 1.5% of your body weight tends to be safe and preserve your lean tissue. Now,
Mm-hmm.
unfortunately, again, the leaner you get, your ability to preserve all of that lean tissue
Yeah.
starts to decline. So, choosing an appropriate rate of weight loss is important. And then the overall duration really depends on the individual's capacity to implement that diet. And that
Mm,
varies wildly. Like your tolerance for an aggressive 1.5% weekly rate of weight loss might be much greater than my ability to tolerate, that same kind of deficit.
yeah.
So there's always some individual variability, but I'd say generally a fat loss phase would last from as few as 8 weeks for someone that's not really striving for major weight loss. Perhaps they're wanting to go on a vacation and they're looking for, I don't know, 3% of their body weight. That's it. Whereas I have other clients that need to, for medical reasons, they are looking at 20% of their body weight loss. So,
Right. Right.
it's a much longer, drawn out process. But it doesn't have to be at a fixed rate either. You might have some
Mm-hmm.
weeks
Mm-hmm.
where you've got a more challenging schedule, you've just got more going on. So you can plan to have a slightly easier approach, to accommodate life. And then you can drop back in, maybe during less busy times with something that's a bit more aggressive. And that doesn't just go for the
Yeah.
nutrition, it's also considering in what you would do with training too. So it's
Right.
kind of a bit of a triage. I'm constantly adjusting clients' exercise output, how much lifting
Mm-hmm.
and how much cardio they're doing, to accommodate their individual circumstances.
Yeah. And when we're talking about tolerating that deficit and tolerating the weight loss process,
Mhm.
for me, being hungry is hard.
Mm.
Like I'm on that thicker build, right? I'm a former athlete, and so I've pretty high muscle mass, and so my metabolism is going, like it's difficult. That certainly the early stages where you start into that deficit, it's really challenging. Talk us through what some people might have to tolerate as they go through that, what they might experience the deeper they go into a deficit.
Yes. So unfortunately, there are a lot of negative symptoms with fat loss. And it's probably one of the reasons we don't see people naturally just walking around with six packs. It is
Yeah.
quite difficult. So I'd say the first thing that you're going to experience is hunger. And honestly, that might be
Mm,
the most challenging of all of the symptoms to navigate. Now, it's been
hmm
interesting as a clinician to have observed the new medical interventions that are kind of coming to
Yeah.
surface with the GLPs
Yeah.
over the last, 5 to 10 years. So that's certainly helping support that process for a lot of people. And it also offers folks a good opportunity to change long-standing habits. Now, you mentioned you're an
Mhm.
athlete, you're used to eating for performance.
Right.
So whether or not the change that you're experiencing is truly physiological, like I am starving, or it's habitual eating. I've always
Right.
eaten this way. I've always
Right.
had this kind of portion size. I've always had 5 meals. When you have the support of some of these, GLPs and appetite suppressants, it can really help change behavior and lead to more
Yeah.
permanent and lasting habit. So hunger is obviously the hardest one to navigate, and there are lots of strategies that you can implement to help with that.
Yeah.
One of those being, voluminous, high fiber foods to help with
Mhm.
gut fullness, and that is a skill to learn. I have not always been, as a dietitian, I don't love vegetables. I haven't. I think my mother used to try and force feed me as a kid, and I
Yeah.
think true honesty, for the first few years of my undergraduate and master's degree, I don't think I touched a vegetable. It was only through getting into bodybuilding that kind of forced me to, Holly, you're going to have to learn how to enjoy veggies,
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
I'm very grateful for, to be honest. I had to do the work there. So hunger can certainly be mitigated through various dietary approaches and different strategy, and it's not always universal between people. Um, Strength adaptations in the downwards direction are unfortunate with
Mhm.
extended fat loss. It doesn't always happen initially, but maybe 8 to 10 weeks into a cut, you may start to experience some performance decrements. It doesn't mean that you're losing muscle as a result. Those two things aren't inherently tied to one another,
Mhm.
but
Mhm.
it's due to low energy availability that you might start to experience some, reductions in strength. That's not necessarily a bad thing. Ultimately, if you are training close to failure and you're still performing a sufficient volume each week,
Mhm.
even if your volume numbers are coming down because you're not lifting the same loads, that's not inherently, cause and effect. It doesn't mean that you've
Yeah.
lost muscle. So strength is one. I think sleep decrements is another challenge for a lot of people. As soon as you start to get hungry, there's
Mhm.
a biological system in place that's signaling to your brain to eat. And unfortunately, it can impact your sleep quality and
Yeah.
duration. So that's a challenge for a lot of folks. GI issues is another one. I've got several competitors right now that I'm working with who are starting to get down to the low end of their calorie range. So we're hitting or
Mhm.
getting close to a calorie floor. And when your total food volume is low, it makes it very difficult to go to the bathroom regularly.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
constipation, bloating, GI distress, and that can often also come from the types of foods that you're trying to use to
Mhm.
hit low calories, maybe more
Right.
processed foods, things that have got added artificial sweeteners, and just things that are generally poorly tolerated by the gut.
Yeah.
And then without the food volume to move things through, people really start to struggle from a GI perspective. And that can be the thing that causes us to stop a diet. I've got one
Right.
client right now who's really struggling, and we've tried everything. There's only so far you can take this. And then I guess the other one is mood, energy levels, just your overall demeanor. I think there is something to be said
Yeah.
for depression. You don't have the same joy for life
Yeah.
anymore. I have a little
Yeah.
bit of soul is lost every time I pray, because I am a foodie at heart. So
Yeah.
it's usually like the last 5 weeks of a fat loss phase where you do have to start kind of putting the brakes on, as much takeout food or as many social obligations. So it can also impact you from a psychological perspective.
Mhm.
If that's something that is meaningful to you and that brings you a sense of fulfillment and happiness, if you start isolating yourself, you become a homebody because you're trying to
Yeah.
avoid eating out, that could be really problematic for people. So there are strategies. I have not missed a weekend eating out, with friends since I can remember. Like I make it work. I wouldn't diet and be a competitor if I couldn't fit that in. So it's certainly
Yeah.
possible, but it's come with 2 decades of practice.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, those would be some of the like physiological symptoms and maybe the
Mhm.
hormonal changes. So unfortunately, the longer you diet, the lower your hormones start to fall, and
Mhm.
that can place you at a higher risk for various outcomes. And I think the worst
Yeah.
are, the reduction in sex hormones, testosterone, thyroid. These
Mhm.
can start to move in a direction that influence hormone production and I guess your overall like health outcomes. So there's a few things that you need to be careful of as you do this process.
Yeah, it's fascinating that trade-off. I think people have to understand between lifestyle and outcome, right? That you really have to understand the level of sacrifice based on your goal.
Mm-hmm.
And so what would be an average duration? Is that another 6-month process? Or you sort of said the rate of fat loss versus the duration, how do you figure that out?
Yeah, so I think everybody's goals are a little bit different. So someone might come to me and say they've got, they'd like to lose body fat and get close to a stage lean physique. They might be at 170 pounds right now. And, I will be able to kind of look at their current body fat percentage and we know where we need to go. For most athletes, for
Yeah.
females, it's probably somewhere between 10 and 15% body fat for females, in between 5 and 7% for males getting on stage. So that kind of allows me to determine how many weeks of dieting we need. Again, using that rule earlier that I mentioned of not exceeding a weekly rate of weight loss of more than 1.5%. And to be fair, I very rarely use that high end
Mhm.
range. For me, when I
Yeah.
diet, I mean, I
Yeah.
work an 80 to 100-hour week at the moment with all of my companies and things. So it's a little
Yeah.
stressful. So I can't diet at a weekly rate of weight loss greater than, say,
Right.
0.4% of my body weight. So it's a little bit slower for that reason. I can still
Yeah.
get to where I want to go, but that makes it sustainable for me. I've got plenty of
Mhm.
clients who are like, I don't have kids. I've got an easy, cruisy job. I don't have any weekend work. Like I've got time for this. And,
Yeah. Yeah.
the target rate of weight loss is a little bit faster, which is great. So, like I said, the duration could be as few as 8 weeks for someone shooting for a much larger body fat goal. A body fat loss goal, it could be up to 20 to 25 weeks. It really depends.
Yeah. I think those numbers even would be surprising to people.
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of people think that, oh, I'm going to do a diet and I'm going to get into single digit body fat. Like stage ready, you said 5 to 7%?
For males and
Yeah.
10 to 15 for females. Yeah.
Yeah. And so just being realistic and understanding that, I think is really important because a lot of people would see themselves, and I would have athletes come back and report, their trainer would send back like their skin fold reports and say, oh, he's 6% body fat. And you're like,
Nah.
nope. So when you accurately measure it and you tell them, no, you're actually more like 22%, and
Mm.
people just can't fathom that that's an actual like number that people would be walking around at.
Yeah, I think we tend to have some good visual models that I show to clients, and also in our app as well. When you go through and choose your estimated body fat percentage, maybe in that scenario, people would be like, "This isn't equating." Like I thought that I was 5 to 7%, yet there the diagram more appropriately is being matched by the 20% one or something.
Yeah,
But
just devastated by this news. Like,
yeah, but this is where like that education piece matters. And I think
yeah.
it can help adjust people's expectations so much better when they have an accurate understanding of where that data is coming from.
Mm-hmm.
Because yes, to get down for a female to get to 10% body fat, I mean, that's what I get to at the last week of my competition. And I might
Right.
stay there for 2 weeks. You couldn't
Right.
pay me enough to want to be at that body fat percentage for a whole, it looks cool, but I would
Yeah.
never want to be there for a whole year.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. I remember going through that week of really cutting. It wasn't for a competition. It was just to experience it.
Oh, yes.
Spent a year training and then like we did this peak week.
Mhm.
And like that, the last few days where you're manipulating water and sodium and carbohydrate and all this stuff. Oh my goodness. Like you said, looked great. The next day I was like, okay, I
Well,
am done with this.
and that's something to think about as well. I think a lot of people aspire to look like, the competitive athletes. And I have no doubt that many people, many could get there,
Yes.
but the ability to sustain it is maybe reserved for a few 1 to 2% of people. And their circumstances are incredibly unique. It might be the difference of, a mom that has 4 children. She might not work, but she's got 4 children with, plenty of after
Mm-hmm.
school responsibilities, life responsibilities, versus somebody that is single, doesn't have any children, and, has a cruisy job, or maybe they don't need to go to work. They have a spouse that takes care of all their bills. The amount of time that then opens back up to that person to be able to sustain a low body fat percentage,
Yeah.
with all of the nutrition, fussing over all of the minor details and making
Yeah.
time for all the, cardio and the lifting. I mean, it's profound. So that's where having
Yeah.
expectations, becomes so important. So,
Yeah. So are those the two main phases then? So we've got the build and the cut. Would
Mhm.
are there other phases that you would go through, or do those would they break down? Maybe the cut phase would break down into some different stages.
No, not really. I think those are the two key ones. There are some individuals who would prefer to do what I would call a recomp phase. So it is basically achieving fat loss and muscle mass simultaneously. It's a little bit slower. It's kind of like the least efficient, but you're not going to be able to do, both 100% effectively at the same time.
Yeah.
So for many people, and again, this might be the difference between competitors, athletes versus Gen Pop. I think that a more sustainable approach, and perhaps a more enjoyable approach for most people, would be to do a recomp. So they're, slowly building muscle through a really sustainable resistance training program. Again, we know muscle grows very slowly. So
Mhm.
as that individual's muscle mass is growing, we're not changing their calories at all. We're just keeping them at a place that feels really reasonable. It's
Yeah.
sustainable. They don't have to think about it too much. And with time, they will start to get leaner because now they're growing muscle. And for every 1
Yeah.
kilogram of muscle you add, your basal metabolic rate is going to go up by about 25 calories. So
Right.
eventually your body starts demanding more fuel. So if you're not changing their calories, now they're actually
Mhm.
starting to get a little bit leaner. So it happens much more slowly. But that seems to be a really realistic approach for the person that perhaps doesn't want to go into an intentional build. Maybe they don't want to add, too much body fat. Maybe they're not comfortable with the process. But that's certainly another approach. So outside of those 3 phases, there isn't anything else. It's
Right.
muscle building, it's fat loss, or you're trying to accomplish body recomp.
Yeah. And it's interesting. I think most people think that that's what they're going to do is the recomp stuff. They think,
Mm.
okay, well, I'm going to build muscle and I'm going to lose body fat.
Mm-hmm.
Often trying to be in a calorie deficit while doing that. And I do think that it's sort of the hard way around.
Mm-hmm.
It's particularly if you're not guided well through it with your nutrition. I think that can be a really challenging place to be in.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly possible. I have plenty of people who've been through a successful recomp, but it is slower, but it kind of prevents the extremes, if that makes sense. So like when you're
Yeah.
doing an intentional diet, your calorie intake's low, you're going through all of those negative symptoms that I described before to kind of get the body fat off. Um,
Mhm.
and yeah, it's just those are the extremes. And then we've got recomp, which kind of keeps your body weight a lot more stable. There aren't the big peaks and troughs with calories. It's very consistent. And I think
Mhm.
for many people, that probably serves them very well.
Right. Right.
Dreams in either direction are generally harder to tolerate. So, yeah, I think that's kind of the major difference between each of those goals.
Mhm. You mentioned some of the muscle building research that's out there as we really look at those phases. What is it taking for the body to go through that muscle building process? Because especially with women, a lot of emphasis right now being put on, we need to add muscle mass.
Hmm.
What does that look like to add skeletal muscle mass?
That's a really interesting question because I think there's a lot of mixed information on social media at the
Yes.
moment. I think I want to preface that for men and women, I have heard claims from prominent PhDs who arguably aren't publishing research in these very niche areas. They're kind of
Yes.
speaking outside of their lane.
Yes.
I won't name names, but there seems to be this false information circulating that women do not or cannot grow as much muscle as men. That is
Right.
factually proven multiple times. I am looking at the studies on my desk right now.
Right.
I'm not going to talk a little bit about them, but women can build just as much muscle as men with the same training regimen. The key
Right.
difference is the relative change. So males biologically, fundamentally are bigger than women.
Right.
So their absolute changes in muscle mass, let's say you and I did a building phase. We do the same
Mhm.
program. You might gain, I don't know, over that 12-week period, 8 pounds, right?
Right.
I might only gain 4 pounds. So if we look at those numbers in absolute terms, you just gained more muscle than I. Obviously, men
Right.
build more muscle than women. The
Right.
relative change from our starting point is the same. It's probably,
Right.
we both gained 10%, from our starting body weight. So I think that's a bit of a myth that needs to be squashed. Women can
Yes.
certainly build the same amount of muscle relative to their body. And then as far as like how we approach training, again, there is a lot of mixed information. The two key drivers of muscle growth are going to be your weekly volume per muscle group per week. And I guess just to provide a quick definition, volume is the total number of sets performed on a given muscle group. So it's sets times the reps times the load. So,
Right.
I might do 3 by 10 by 100 pounds on some exercise. That would be the volume for that, or the amount of work that I do in that exercise. We can also
Mhm.
look at it from the perspective of the total number of sets per muscle group per week.
Yeah.
So volume is one of the key drivers of hypertrophy, and then your proximity to failure. So we've had
Mm.
studies now compare different rates of perceived exertion, or another metric that we often refer to is repetitions in reserve. These are both metrics that you'd use to gauge the intensity or the effort that's put
Yeah.
in when you're lifting, going to failure basically. So 7 through to 10 seems to be about the sweet spot for initiating the maximal amount of muscle mass that you could
Right.
possibly grow in that set. I think as a former athlete, I think that is a really good piece of information to have, because I used to be of the mentality that I needed to go hard or go home. Now
Yeah.
I've got a ratio, I've got a range that I can work within. It's like
Yes.
7 through to 10. So for me, when I go to the gym and I'm feeling a bit tired, especially when I'm dieting, that used to really bother me that I couldn't train well. I'd feel down about myself because I couldn't train, 100%. But we now have great data to support the fact that 7 through to 10 still elicits the same muscle growth
Yeah.
response. So hopefully that gives people a bit more flexibility on those hard days when they're feeling tired. Maybe they've just had a
Yeah.
bad day at work. Something is still better than nothing. So still go to the gym, but just lower your expectations a little bit, drop the volume.
Yeah.
And you can still get a really effective workout for muscle building.
Touch on that 1 second, Holly. That's similar. I think that messaging coming from the same individual you might be referencing, like women have to lift heavy with no real,
Mm.
and that definition of you got to be lifting like 3 to 4 rep maxes. And I just think that's pretty high risk for somebody, who might have osteoporosis, hearing this and wanting to lift weights for the first time, and they're going to come in and hit a 3 rep max,
Mm-hmm.
not really knowing how strong they are. Right? Where is that? Right? Like, I think that definition of proximity to failure, it also allows for progress.
Mm.
And it's that overload principle. Like when I first start lifting, my weight I lift for 8 reps is going to be much less than when I'm 6 months in, and be
Mm-hmm.
more weight for the same number of reps. And so I think that definition, it allows so much more room for people to train safely, effectively, and
Mm-hmm.
to make progress.
Absolutely. I want to touch on the comment that you made about, I guess I'll call it low versus high load training. So again, I think there's a lot of misinformation, especially being targeted to women, that we are
Yeah.
unique species. We don't share any of the same biology as males, and that we
Oh yeah.
sometimes meant to train differently because of X, Y, and Z. There are data, and I want to preface this, there is acute data There is,
Mm-hmm.
I guess, data that specifically looks like at the endocrine system that might indicate that, there are all these kind of changes in your hormonal profile that, lead to inflammation or that, blunt muscle protein synthesis. But when you actually look at the long-term data
Mm-hmm.
and the actual
Mm-hmm.
training outcomes, we don't see these, strange differences. And I think that's kind of the point that's being missed.
Yeah.
So when it comes to the amount of weight that you lift, I want to first define low load versus high load training. So high load training is predominantly working out with somewhere between 8 to 15 repetitions. This is kind of traditional high load strength training. And that is generally using somewhere around 70% of your 1 rep max. We've also got a concept of training or a type of training modality that's called low load training that uses much lower percentages of your 1 rep max. So it's probably somewhere between 20 and 50, 60%. And generally the rep range is like 15 and above. And that
Right.
might extend all the way up to, and believe it or not, we've got studies that show that 90 repetitions has still led to the same hypertrophy response
Yeah.
as 8 to 12.
Yeah.
So when we think about those two different training modalities that are the hypertrophy kind of, I guess, options that
Yeah.
are presented to us, they both achieve the same muscle growth response.
Mm-hmm.
So again, opening the door to flexibility, there are so many different ways that you could train and get
Yeah.
great results. But we are being told online, and this is
Yeah.
even one step in the opposite direction again, that you have to lift between, 3 and 6 reps.
Yeah.
I've heard that, like it has to be really heavy. And that is traditionally what we would call strength training.
Yes.
But that will help you get strong. But it's
Mm.
not the only way to train. And if I'm being perfectly reasonable, if we look at studies that compare strength specific training, up to about 8 reps with, higher repetitions, 8 through to 25, there are meaningful differences in muscle growth. We don't see the same kind of muscle growth response at those low loads as we
Mm-hmm.
do working, in the typical hypertrophy range, which I would
Yeah.
consider 8 up to probably 50 is about my cutoff.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
then we are conversing about time efficiency. I think
Yeah.
you could,
Exactly.
if you
Yeah.
wanted to do 90 reps, go ahead. But from an
Yeah.
efficiency perspective, there's a reason I wouldn't prescribe that.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah, you don't need to lift heavy to build muscle. You need to have a sufficient amount of volume per week. You need to be training with somewhere between 8 and let's call it 50 repetitions, as long as those
Yeah.
those sets are taken to almost to failure. That's 7 to 10 rep range, 7 to 10 RPE range. That seems to risk or cause the similar type of muscle growth response.
Yeah. And just for women who are lifting, somebody like yourself who has trained women, research in the lab, coaching, like practical application. I was the head strength coach for UC Santa Barbara. We had 250 female athletes.
Mhm.
They would come in from 5 a.m, fasted, hungover, often all the way up until we had groups at 8 p.m, and in all different states of fatigue and fed and fasted and
Mhm.
everything. And every single one of them adapted.
Mhm.
Every one of them. They got stronger. We prevented injuries. That's the other thing. People saying, oh, women are just, we can't prevent these injuries. We didn't have a single ACL tear in 4 years. We can do this in
Mhm.
all sorts of different states. And I just think that the human race wouldn't have lasted very long if women were this fragile, if women had to train in this very specific way. I just think that we have to really think about how we're communicating, how people can train, and make it really steer away from this predatory marketing that is making women fearful and overcomplicating their training so that they
Mhm.
buy my program.
Mhm.
I got the
And look,
answer for it.
and I think that, some of these people that are promoting these types of messaging, I don't think they're intentionally trying to misrepresent the data. Sometimes it's you don't know what you don't know. And I think a lot of these people maybe have stepped away from doing,
Mm-hmm.
in-person research and they're not very well versed in the current body of literature. And that's one area where for the last 5 years, every single week, I review 2 papers on my YouTube. So I feel really comfortable in like discussions of resistance training, muscle growth, all of the different training variables that, lead to growth response. And these individuals might have come from a background of endurance, they're kind of venturing into like the importance of muscle for our metabolic health and for bone mineral density and just longevity at large. And they're kind of misrepresenting the current information through lack of knowledge, or sometimes it's not even that. I think social media, it likes attention seeking, big, bold statements, confident statements, definitive statements. And a lot of the time, the studies that we're looking at are answering a question that is this tiny. It's in this population group with these testing conditions measured with this, particular measurement instrument. And we're not able to take the response of that study and just apply it to everybody. That's where having a good knowledge of all of that literature is quite a challenge to do. That's why we have true experts. And often those people aren't on social media. They're in the lab. They're busy concentrating on their work. So we're getting people like maybe you and I would consider myself a science communicator. I am just interpreting that information and trying to dispel it in as simple way as possible. But short clips on social media don't lend themselves very well to the nuance. I did a video just recently on YouTube that was talking exactly about this concept, and it does make it really difficult because I think science communication on social media is not really science communication anymore. We're kind of missing the importance of the nuance and those fine details that give relevance and meaning to that study outcome.
So I think the next little piece I want to dig into that cutting phase, because I think people try and live their life there. A lot of people sort of think they've got to stay and be in a calorie deficit all the time. What does that cutting phase look like for you? And are there differences? For example, if I come to you and I'm starting my cutting phase, is there a difference between that initial fat loss and then the last 3-4%? Like, what does it take at each stage of the cut in order to be able to achieve your results? Or is it just time?
I think it's a combination of time and considering the individual's like metabolic adaptation response. And that does vary a little bit, but based on most of the research that we have, it's probably somewhere between 90 to 150 calories. And I may perhaps better explain what I mean by that. When we implement a fat loss phase, the body will try to resist. Obviously, if we think about how humans have evolved over the years, we haven't always had this surplus of food and, a plentiful supply of food available to us. So we have these biological processes or breaks that will try to slow you down or prevent you from losing too much body fat. That's why we have all of these kind of alarm bells, which are the negative symptoms of dieting, to prevent us from starving ourselves to death. So these are good things. It's great that we have them, but it is challenging if you're trying to exceed what's normal for females, for example, for male body comp. So as far as like the overall like process for me, when we're working out what somebody's deficit needs to be, we can apply a very specific amount of energy to every gram of weight that somebody's losing. So I'm trying to think about the best way that I can kind of summarize this for you. If I wanted to lose a consistent 1/2 pound every week, there is a certain calorie deficit that would require. And I'll use an arbitrary number. It's probably close, maybe 250 calorie deficit to do that. So every single day, I would need to be in a 250 calorie deficit. But of course, as you are dieting, your body's requirements are going down. So, your new maintenance calories might be a little bit lower. So I have to keep taking that 250 calories off every day to keep losing body fat. So eventually, as you get down to more challenging calorie targets, it becomes more difficult to consistently hit that 250 calorie deficit if you're trying to lose a pound a week. So, we then have to start tapping into increasing energy expenditure through more cardio or adding in maybe another day of lifting if they're open to it, to kind of maintain that steady deficit. So I will say it is easier at the beginning of a fat loss phase to lose that half of a pound, because the numbers that you're starting on are much higher. The amount of activity that you have to do to maintain that deficit is probably not too hard, but it gets more and more challenging the longer you've been dieting. So there isn't a difference in the approach. Like there is no meaningful change for me other than the fact that I might make my weekly rate of weight loss less aggressive because
Yeah, right.
I can't take a 250 calories off anymore to achieve that because I'm at my calorie floor. Like it's not safe or efficacious. I'd start to compromise my macronutrient availability, my protein and energy availability. You don't want to compromise those things. So the weekly rate is the same the entire way through until it might become too challenging to keep adhering to that. You might have to make a bit of a smaller jump to keep moving forwards. Like I can't consistently show up and keep hitting those kinds of deficits each week.
And that's why people might find that last 5 to 10 pounds of weight loss so challenging. Maybe they don't realize that they're actually not at their deficit, or that they're not quite at the same deficit that they would have been before. And it is harder to lose that last little bit.
Yes, exactly. And I think the other thing as well is as you get down to the lower body fat percentage range, you do start to see the changes a little bit more quickly, in my opinion, because you've now got less body fat. So a small change on the scale, let's say you only lost, 0.4 of a pound, that might be very noticeable in the mirror because you didn't have a whole lot of body fat on you already. And now you're really starting to see the underlying muscle. Whereas losing 0.4 of a pound early on in your fat loss phase, when you've got a lot of body fat, you're looking around going, where is it? I don't see any changes. Like, where is it? So perhaps it makes sense for some people to start off their fat loss phase at a slightly more aggressive target. If they can implement that into their lifestyle, they will probably therefore see more, prominent numbers and drops on the scale each week. But that wouldn't be sustainable all the way through. You'd probably have to start making those cuts a little bit smaller. As it becomes more challenging, you want to modify that to help with the symptoms and just the reality of you're going to run out of calories and you're going to run out of time in the day to keep creating the deficit that you need. So
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Well, I've already kept you over the hour here. And so this has just been an absolute treasure trove for people. I really appreciate it. And I know we could keep going on this, but we end every episode with 3 takeaways that you would like the listeners to take away as they start on this journey and they start thinking about body composition adjustment. What are the 3 key things that you would like people to bear in mind as they start this journey?
Oh, you're giving me a limit to 3. Goodness. Okay. I think I would say set realistic expectations. So that means having a good understanding of the rate at which muscle grows. If you're considering embarking on a muscle building phase, this isn't something that's going to happen overnight. You need a minimum of 6 months intentionally not dieting, thinking about fueling for performance, training hard so that you can build muscle, because that's what's going to allow your body to burn more calories and make future fat loss easier. Now you can do the same programs, but you're burning more energy because you've got this more muscular body. So I think set really realistic expectations around muscle building phases. When it comes to fat loss, set realistic expectations around the weekly rates of weight loss. It's one thing to do extremes and maybe you can sustain extreme fat loss for a short period of time. But ultimately, you need to decide, what's more important, the speed at which you get there or the ability for it to be sustainable. I would argue sustainable fat loss is a bigger and more important goal for many of us. So choosing a weekly rate of weight loss that fits with your lifestyle and do it in a way that fits with your preferences, because it's one thing to diet in a way that gets you the results quickly. But if you were eating in a way that you couldn't stand, you hated all the food, if you felt like you were sacrificing so much to get there, you're just going to go right back to all the things that you actually enjoy. So I think recognizing what are deal breakers and what are not for you, as an example, like I love to eat out 2 times on the weekend. I go for dinners, I go for brunches. I love a glass of wine. I have cocktails. I love all that stuff. And I will not take those out just to be a competitive athlete. They stay in my diet. So I've found a way to be able to get down to stage lean conditioning, but not sacrifice all the little things that, make it easier and more enjoyable to sustain.
Yeah.
And then protein recommendations. I know we didn't touch on this today, but I think it's really important. There was once upon a time where I was given a set hard and fast number that I had to eat every single day. Recognize that it is a range for a reason. It doesn't need to be at the top end of that range. It can be anywhere along that range, and you are still going to get a really great response to your resistance training. And arguably, it's the training that is perhaps even more important than the protein itself. And I think recognizing that you don't have to train every single day to get a really good physique. I know we didn't talk about the specific number of sets per week, but you don't need to train, 6 days a week to have a stage lean, awesome looking physique. It's usually about the overall time that you've spent consistently lifting and showing up. So I think a 3 to 4 day resistance training program is more than sufficient if you've got an optimized volume on the muscle groups that you care about. So I think that's my 3. I've got 20 more to you, but I'll stop there.
Well, so where can people find you for the remaining 17 items?
Well, I'd say the most educational space that you can go would be my YouTube channel. That is where, as I mentioned earlier, every week I do breakdowns of the latest research, and I'll take the studies and I'll tell you exactly about it and then summarize it and give people practical takeaways. So YouTube always is 10 to 15 minute long form videos. Instagram, I do shorthand versions of all of that, but they're both my name, which is just Holly T. Baxter.
Right. And where could people work with you if they're interested in seeking you out for coaching?
Yeah, so I have a website for my nutrition company, which is beabody.com. And then I also have a fitness application. We're in the process of finalizing the nutrition one too. So that's getbeafit.com. So we have an awesome training app that is fantastic.
Outstanding. Well, we'll make sure there's links to all of that and make sure everyone can find you from the episode. And we just appreciate you coming on so much and sharing all this wisdom with us.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Well, that was a great conversation with Holly Baxter. And it really became clear to me as we went through the conversation exactly why physique competitors and bodybuilders are the true masters of body composition manipulation. So here are the 3 key things that you can take away from that episode. Number 1, set realistic expectations around muscle building and fat loss timelines. Muscle grows slowly, and fat loss gets harder the leaner you get. And the approach that fits your actual lifestyle will always outlast the aggressive one that does not. Number 2, choose a rate of fat loss that is sustainable and fits your preferences, not just the fastest option available. Identify your non-negotiables and build your approach around them. A diet you can stick to will always beat the perfect plan that you abandon. Number 3, understand that training may matter even more than hitting the top end of your protein target. And showing up regularly over years is what actually moves the needle. If this episode resonated with you, the best way to support the show is to follow us wherever you listen to your podcasts and leave a rating or a review. It makes a real difference in helping us reach more people who could benefit from these conversations. You can stay connected with us on Instagram, LinkedIn, and YouTube at Vitality Collective Performance, where we share additional insights, behind-the-scenes content, and updates on upcoming episodes. The information shared in this episode is for educational purposes only and is not intended as medical advice. Always consult a qualified healthcare professional before making any changes to your training, recovery, or health practices. Thanks for being here, and we'll see you next time.